Greetings, I am Shad. In my video, The Real Names of Swords, I go through and mention the actual names of swords. What I want to do in this video is talk about where these swords would be classified in the things that they're often featured in pop culture, role-playing games and video games. In video games and role-playing games in general, the classification of weapons usually fall into three categories: small, medium, and large. Now, thinking of these terms, small, medium, large, it's very easy to see where these swords fall into. Short sword, small; arming sword, medium; long sword, large. Now, generally, the great sword is the large two-handed sword in that category, but that should really be long sword. The long sword is the two-handed weapon. But what about the great sword? Because the great sword's cool, man! Look at it! It's huge! Who doesn't want to fly around in their old place with this big massive sword chopping dragons in half? Yeah, you want to play with this sword. But it's a bit unfair then to classify the great sword as just another large weapon, because it is so much bigger than the standard two-handed sword. Now again, if you think the great sword is already covered because there's great sword in video games, again, watch my videos. They're long swords, okay? They achieve what long swords have. They do, in damage statistics, they're long swords as well. To include the great sword properly into role-playing game, video games, it needs another feature that separates it from standard two-handed swords. And that feature is, of course, reach. Great swords are massive. Yes, they have reach. They're polearms. You see, great swords need to be classified in with the polearm group, because with polearms, Dungeons & Dragons have done this, they give the feature reach. This can be achieved in two different ways with the standard size categories in video games and role-playing games of small, medium, and large. The first way is to have a set of large weapons, two-handed weapons, with an additional feature, the reach feature. And this is what Dungeons & Dragons do in 3rd edition, 3.5. I didn't really go into 4th edition. I considered it an abomination. And 5th edition, I'm sorry, Dungeons & Dragons, I have had my fun, and I am very grateful to you for the fun I've had playing, but I'm beyond it now. I've graduated past it. And not to say that, oh, look at me, I'm so much better now. It's just that I've gotten fed up with problems in it, so I've just made my own. Yeah, just made my own role-playing game. Of course, when I say I've made my own, it's myself and my brother have made our own role-playing game, which you can check out at It's Tabletop Time. We play it, we live stream it, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. But Dungeons & Dragons is still out there, and I love Dungeons & Dragons. And so they do have this mechanic. I don't know if 5th edition they've kept this, but with large weapons they have an additional, well, it's not a separate class, there's a group of large weapons, two-handed weapons, that have the reach feature. Of course, the other way, when I was saying there's two ways that you could class, these weapons in the standard video game classes, is to just have small, medium, large, and then an additional class, reach. So you have small weapons, medium weapons, large weapons, reach weapons. And that does the exact same thing. And of course, you can put pros and cons in the statistics or the game mechanics. So reach weapons, of course, you can hit things further away, but the big problem with them is in close confined quarters. Can you see yourself using this in a corridor or a hallway, or when you're surrounded by lots of people and you can't fight properly because you're hitting the ground and... yeah, it's difficult, and so it's logical to have a negative, in the rules. So it makes sense to have a drawback, a negative feature with weapons with reach, because you get some and you lose some. Now, I have no idea who will watch my videos that have any involvement with making video games or making role-playing games, but if you so happen to find your way to my channel or to this video, I implore you to use some logic in your classification. I'm mainly looking at you, Wizard of the Coast, even though I might not be playing D&D very much lately because I've got other systems I'm enjoying. I still have a fondness for Dungeons & Dragons, and many people will get introduced to medieval weapons and terminology through Dungeons & Dragons. So don't mislead people! You have power influence to educate. There's a lot of people who like swords out there. We all like medieval fantasy. That's why we play Skyrim. That's why we play Dungeons and Dragons. That's why we like Lord of the Rings and all the other games that comes out with Lord of the Rings. Because we like this genre. We like this kind of the themes of this period of history. So if we are going to make video games or role-playing games, please use some logic. Heed my advice and counsel. This is my suggestion to you, to use this category system. So small weapons, short swords, daggers, we understand. They all kind of go in there. Medium weapons, arming swords, battle axes. Large weapons, two-handed weapons. So the bigger battle axes, the long sword. The long sword is a two-handed sword. That's where this belongs. The long sword belongs in large weapons. And don't go trying to tell me the longsword is already covered because bastard swords are included. No, they're not! Well, yes, they kind of are, because the great swords in most video games and role-playing games are long swords anyway. They just don't show them or represent them properly. But really, bastard sword doesn't even need to be included or to be given separate special mechanics or rules, because the bastard sword is just, it's a little bit smaller version of a long sword. It functions the same. If you give it the rules of a long sword, a bastard sword, one and the same, so don't even bother including it. And if you like certain rules that say, with special training you can use a bastard sword in one hand, well, that applies to the long sword just as equally, but it's silly. You don't want to use a long sword in one hand when you have an arming sword. So just by putting that mechanic in, you encourage people to think, I can dual wield these big long swords. I mean, it's cool, it's fantasy, yeah, you know, it'd be cool to say you could dual wield two long swords, or essentially dual wielding two bastard swords, because bastard swords are long swords, and to say you can, that's cool, but it's impractical and it's not realistic. But it's fantasy, so I guess, you know, if you want to use that mechanic, sure, go ahead, because fantasy, you can break all the rules. We've seen the sizes that swords can come in fantasy, and I mean, the greatsword being the biggest sword-like weapon, even though it's not really a sword, it's a polearm, it's not used like a sword, but it's a, you know, sword-like weapon because it has a blade, handle, crossguard. This being the big, I mean, fantasy craps on this, because you've seen Cloud's Buster sword, you've seen the big ones, and they're cool, I reckon they're cool. I reckon big giant swords are just fun sometimes, but you need to, you know, understand the difference, fantasy and reality. I really have nothing against having huge giant swords in role-playing, you know, game systems, video games. And if you want to have a mechanic that says, you could use this in one hand, you know, who am I to argue, but the reality is you could never use this in one hand. So it depends how much, you know, realism do you want. And also when you break with reality to a very big extent, it can destroy the immersion that someone has is enjoying it. Like for me, when I'm watching a medieval movie that's using things that it's, you know, trying to show medieval stuff accurately, when they get stuff like this wrong, it just destroys the immersion, rips me right out of the world they're in. And that's not fun. You want to enjoy a movie the whole way through. You don't want to get ripped out by stupid inconsistencies. I don't get ripped out in like Final Fantasy, you know, with Cloud and everything, because that's the whole, you know, beginning. The beginning of it is a pure fantasy and it starts that way. But if you have a movie that's trying to say, we're being very medievally because we're gritty and we've got dirt on our faces and our clothes look medieval and stuff, use some brains and know where things fit and know how they are used. A long sword will not really be used in one hand. It won't be used in conjunction with a shield. There are exceptions, everything like that, but let's stay with the general landscape of things. The arming sword is the sword for one hand. You don't have a handle extending longer so people could grapple and get in the way. It doesn't get in the way. It's got way more articulation in the wrist. And interestingly, its cuts are basically almost the same as a long sword. There's not much difference in terms of damage potential between an arming sword and a long sword. But of course, that's another video for another time. So if we are going to make video games or role-playing games, please use some logic, and this is my suggestion to you, to use this category system at least. Short sword, small weapon. Arming sword, medium weapon. Long sword, large two-handed weapon. And great sword, you could classify it in the two-handed large weapon category, but with reach. This is how these weapons operate in reality. Use it! These are the swords. These are how I feel they should be classed or categorized in video games and role-playing games. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.